Brian Field with Crown Appraisals is here with me, and I believe Tim Hodge on his team is with us virtually. We do have a presentation. For those of you that might recall, we did have the Crown Appraisal team give a presentation on their findings of phase one back in December of 2018. And earlier this year, we asked Crown to update that phase one study because some time has passed and there might be more comparable sales out there. And we really want this phase one study to serve as a strong backbone for the ultimate valuation of the rest of the flowage easements. And so I'll give just a few introductory comments here, and then I'll turn things over to Brian to walk through this presentation. Presentation overview. I think this will be relatively short and sweet, but we have an overview of the project. We have several other mitigation programs for the upstream mitigation area. A key to those mitigation efforts is the purchase of flowage easements. And so Brian will talk about their findings of the flowage easement study. And we'll be happy to take a few questions if you have them. You're all familiar with the project. This is just a map showing the project as we know it here, and the staging area shown in that green area on the bottom. Second map here showing the 100-year floodplain after the project is in place. And so again, we have some induced flooding upstream of the project. This is the area where we need to purchase flowage easements. And here's a zoomed in version of that. This is the latest version of the upstream mitigation area map. We have broken this down into 4 distinct zones. And again, on the North Dakota side, we have concurrence from the state engineer about how we're proposing to purchase these purchase the flowage easements and specifically where we need to purchase them. On the Minnesota side, this is part of the ongoing discussions through the contested case hearing. But one thing to point out here is that the project will require temporary storage of floodwaters within these 4 different zones. And the Diversion Authority has an obligation to acquire a property right. We've assumed, that property right is a flowage easement. And the flowage easement is really one of several mitigation measures, including the supplemental crop insurance program that we just talked a little bit about. We also have established a debris cleanup, and so anytime it floods, you might understand that there's going to be a sort of a beach ridge of debris and corn stubble and gas cans or whatever it might be that float up. We've talked about providing, in fact, we've committed to providing the producers with some help in removing that debris. And then lastly on here is the dispute resolution board, and so the model is super sophisticated. And we can map out where there might be impacts, but a producer or a property owner might feel like they have been impacted beyond where we've already provided mitigation. And so in those scenarios, we've conceptualized a dispute resolution board. Some more details of that need to be stood up here in the next several months or year. But that dispute resolution board will really be an administrative process that the property owners can go to rather than having to file some lawsuit. And that dispute board would then adjudicate claims, weigh all the evidence, and try to resolve the matter. And so those are a summary of some of the mitigation programs that are out there. Again, today wanted to focus on flowage easements, but wanted the group to just be reminded that we do have other mitigation programs for the staging area as well. And so with that, I'd maybe turn to Brian if he wants to come up and give the summary of their study.
Thanks, Eric. As Eric said, my name is Brian Field, and I'm with Crown Appraisals right here in Fargo. And as he had mentioned, we initially presented to this group just under 2 years ago in December of 18 on our phase 1 flowage easement market study, which is the intent of it is to eventually implement into a phase 2 where we actually estimate the diminution in value for each of the individual parcels that will be impacted in the 4 different mitigation zones. But since it's been 2 years since that point, we were asked to update it. So we're going to call this study phase 1B. And I guess I hadn't planned on getting too really deep into the details today because we had done that before, and I think Everybody here is pretty familiar with what we did, but if not, just stop me and ask a question. That's fine. And we have Tim on the line here too from Michigan. But essentially, what we were asked to do is okay, we've had 2 years since we last looked at this. Let's look at it again just to see if anything has changed, and if so, what. So we went back to the well and we went through the very same process as we went through the first time, and we had the same folks involved. Jeff Berg and I at Crown Appraisals, we're the local connection, and then we brought in Tim and Doug Hodge from Michigan. Doug is an appraiser that we have known for many, many years, who specializes in unique projects such as this, and his son Tim is an economist with Oakland University in Michigan. So we gathered a whole bunch of data all around the country to try to nail down what this flowage easement, what its impact should be on the market. So we looked at several different areas around the country. And well, I kind of went through a lot of the things on this slide here, how it will be implemented in phase 2 once we have the NDSU ag impact studies and the hydrology studies. Once we get those back, we can apply our rates here in the appraisal process. But in our nationwide investigation, we called people from all over that we know. Fortunately, Jeff and Doug and myself are fairly well connected amongst rural appraisers who would work in these types of markets. We were able to identify markets here locally on both sides of the river, as well as in Missouri. But we did also look in Iowa and Nebraska along the Missouri River, areas that we know have been impacted. For phase 1B, we made sure to go back and check around the Omaha area again, Omaha, Council Bluffs, Sioux City, where they really had a lot of flood damage from last year's flooding along the Missouri River, to see if anything had changed there. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. One of the biggest undertakings of this project was a regression analysis, where we collected sales over a 29-year period from 1992 all the way to today. And over the last 2+ years or so, from the original phase 1 study, we were able to find a couple hundred more sales in just the southern valley, the 6 counties of the south end of the Red River Valley here. And we kept the same parameters of our searches last time, where we were basically looking within 15 miles or so either side of the river, 2 or 3 townships away, to try to keep similar quality of ground with similar production capabilities and drainage and things of that nature. All the same variables that impact market value of farmland. And as part of our market study, it's important to understand that we are really looking at 2 separate impacts. Number one, we're looking at the loss of development rights on a lot of the property, taking away the landowner's right to not per se develop it into a subdivision or some large complex, but more so into a farmstead or a rural residential building site, things of that nature. Those rights are going away. That stick is coming out of the bundle of rights. So what's that worth? And you're also losing the right to not have your property flooded. So that is worth something. And then the second part we looked at was the increased flood risk. And for that, we looked up in the northern end of the valley, north of Grand Forks, between Grand Forks and the Canadian border, where flooding is much more frequent on a lot of properties, specifically right along the river, roughly between I-29 on the North Dakota side and Highway 75 on the Minnesota side. Those properties tend to get hit a little bit more frequently, even more so than they do down in our area here. What we found is that the diminution in value from an easement, the presence of a flowage easement was approximately 8 to 10%, and for increased flooding was in the 7 to 25% range. So the loss of property rights, this is where we looked at, as I mentioned, we looked all around the country, and the only place that we could really find anything very similar where they have similar flowage easements that are proposed for this project up here was down in the boot heel of Missouri, in an area called the Birds Point, New Madrid area. It's right along the Mississippi River. The Corps had bought easements way back in the 1930s and 40s, had never utilized them. But in 2011, as all the water was coming down the Mississippi and Missouri, it was pretty apparent that the town of Cairo, Illinois, which is right across the river from this portion of Missouri, it was pretty apparent that there was going to be a catastrophic loss if they didn't do anything. So for the first time ever, the Corps went in and they blew out the levee and flooded all of the acres in which they had purchased flowage easements before. So that made us look at that area to say, okay, how did blowing that levee change the value of farmland, or did it change the value of farmland? Maybe it hadn't. What we found, looking at a lot of sales both before and after that 2011 event, is that prior to blowing the levee, there was essentially no difference in value of ground that had an easement versus the ground that didn't have an easement on it. It was no difference that was really discernible, because the levee had never been blown. It had been 80 years and people had forgot about it, and the market had forgot about it. Fast forward to 2011, the Corps comes and blows this levee out, and essentially what happened is the market just stopped. It seized. There was essentially no sales in that area for 2011. Then what we were able to observe in the couple of years following was that all of a sudden, when the market participants understood that, yeah, this can really happen and the land can be flooded without any say from us, we noticed a reduction in value of about 8 to 10% on the property that has an easement versus ground that doesn't. So that's what we identified as the value, or the diminution in value, due to the presence of a flowage easement. Then for the increased flooding risk, as I mentioned, we went up to the north end of the valley to look for that. We went back there again this time, and we were able to find a handful of additional pairings than what we had before. It did change our range very slightly up there. Not a tremendous amount. It was originally 11 to 36% diminution in value on those more flood-prone properties. But this time it has increased to 11 to 43%, but still fairly close to our original findings. So again, further support for what we had found 2 years ago. And let's see here. I would like to bring Tim in a little bit to talk about the regression study. Where do we want him at? Just a little bit to kind of explain what he did, and he can kind of give you a quick summary of that. So Tim, are you on?
I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So Brian could probably explain it just as well, but I'll do my best. Thank you, Brian. So what we had done, as Brian had mentioned, was we collected a large number of land sales and added to what we originally had, which gave us over 2,000 sales from which to try to identify any actual market effects from flooding. So Brian was talking about easement. This is more of the market effect of flooding. So what we were able to do with those sales was we were able to identify those that had never flooded versus those that were subject to flooding, as well as those that were subject to flooding, and we knew they were within the floodplain. And so what we were able to do is to kind of, in a quick snapshot, is identify those that were subject to flooding as the treatment group and those that weren't subject to flooding as the control group. It's important to have that control group because we have to know what's happening to that control group throughout the entire process of this time. And so once a flood happens, we're able to identify through those market sales what the effect of that flooding is on the sales that actually did flood. So we used a regression analysis technique, a multiple regression analysis, where we were able to control for a number of factors that would influence the sales in order to further identify and control for differences between the sales to ensure that the control group was as similar as we could get other than the treatment effect itself. Now, I know that's a lot of jargon, and I'd be happy to take questions, but it's basically just a very standard statistical approach for identifying different effects based on whether or not a property had flooded. And what we were able to come up with, both before we updated the study, the initial report, phase 1, as well as phase 1B, was that properties that did flood during flood periods. Now, if memory serves me correct, and I should probably pull this up just to make sure it's serving me correct, is prior to the actual flood event, there wasn't any noticeable differences between flood and non-flood property, much like what Brian had mentioned they noticed in the other area. But what then happened is once the flood took effect, property that had flooded in that period and that sold during that period generally sold from about 6 to, in the regression analysis portion, about 6 to 10% or 6 to 9% less than the control group, which indicated that this flood does have a negative impact on property values once they are subject to flooding. I mean, I'd be happy to try to talk about the specifics if anybody is curious, but it can get quite burdensome quickly. Hopefully that gives you a good enough snapshot of what we had done.
Quick question for you.
Yeah.
We have a really short-term memories when it comes to flooding. So,
yes.
And it looks beautiful down by the river.
Yes.
In the middle of July. So what kind of a time frame do you limit yourself to when you review these sales?
Great question. So what we had started, I surveyed the literature, scoured the literature before this, and Fargo residents, Fargo farmers aren't the only ones with amnesia when it comes to flooding, right? It is nice to live next to water. So that was an effect that we were concerned with going in. So what we had started in this process, and the other issue with Fargo compared to typical flooding type studies, it happens infrequently, right? You think about some of these coastal floodings, it's obviously happening more and more frequently over the last 20 years everywhere. But what we've seen in the past is, you have a before flood event, then you have a post flood event, and then you have a long period post flood event before the next flood happens. And so sometimes in traditional studies, you'll see this amnesia not set in for 3, 4, 5 years. Well, Fargo has floods happening during this period of study within 5, 6 years of each other. So we recognize that, and what we first did to identify is we said, okay, let's look at the market effect within 1 year after a flood event. And that's what this is capturing, because we recognize, over time, people are going to perhaps forget about this, or maybe the market conditions in the commodity prices are such that, who cares about flooding at this moment? Let's just buy land. And we've already forgotten about flooding. And so we looked at the 1 year period. We saw these effects happening within the first year. But then by year 2, year 3, these negative effects seemed to go away. But it was consistent, every time this flood event happens. And again, we couldn't narrow it down to one specific flood, whether it was the 97 flood, the 2009 flood. We had to kind of combine those together as a flood event because one flood event with the number of sales isn't going to give you much statistical confidence in anything, right? There's only X number of farm sales that happen in the area a year. So, but we were able, to your point, we were able to say, okay, there is a diminishing time frame with which people seem to keep this in the forefronts of their minds. And yeah, the market isn't responding 2 years after the flood event the same way they've responded in the year of the flood event. And we did look at that.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
Kevin Campbell, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you. In your process here, do you take into consideration the level of impacts? For example, if a property is flooded 3 feet versus 3 inches?
Yep. So we looked at this a number of ways, and I've looked at this even more ways than are shown in the report, and it's pretty consistent. We looked at this in terms of depth. We looked at this in terms of coverage. We do have estimates that speak to each of those more specifically, because we do know that just because you flood doesn't mean you're going to have the same level of flooding as other properties. So when it came to more of a depth issue, right, we're concerned with, well, the greater the depth, the longer the dry down period is likely to be. Or with the coverage issue, right, if you are covered at 25%, that doesn't mean that planting is necessarily going to be delayed, because you have 75% of your property that can still be worked while the other portion maintains or continues to be flooded. So we looked at those different snapshots to look at that, right? When it came to percent flooded, we got a percentage basis where it was, for each percent, it's increase or decreasing the price by 0.1%. And on average, that worked out to be slightly different than our estimates. It's still within the 6 to 10% range if it's 100% flooded, but we did look at these alternate views to make sure that we were accounting for not just flooded versus non-flooded, but how does this look with different types of flood events for each property. So yeah, we did. Short answer, yes, we looked at these different flood depths and coverages in our results, and they were pretty consistent.
Thank you.
And I do want to say, and I'm sure Brian will probably get to this. I was pretty pleased to have this happen. This was something, right? This is a technique that isn't something that we came up with. It's not something that I'm, experimenting with and trying to use Fargo as a test case and showing a new regression or a new statistical package. This is a tried and true method. This is actually this study. I wrote a paper based on these findings that has been accepted for publication in Land Economics, which is a high quality economics journal that surrounds land and agricultural issues. And in that process, it was a very long process. The first submission was in 2018. It just got accepted this year, right? Where it's a double blind review process. We submit it to the journal. They send it out to other professionals, other PhD level economists in the field. They look at the methods, they give feedback, they make sure that it's appropriately modeled. The identifiers or the treatment groups are appropriately identified. And so it goes through a long 2+ year period process, and it has been accepted for publication in that journal. So that's just a testament to the methods. Again, I want to stress that because this isn't something that we are coming up with. These are standard methods accepted in the profession for looking at these types of issues.
Thanks, Tim. In the interest of time, we're going to have to wrap it up here, but we thought that was a very important thing to get accomplished as part of this process, to have Tim submit that paper for peer review, to add even more credence and support to the methodology used in this report. It's very, very sound, and I think that really helps to prove that. So to cut to the chase here, the increased flood risk summary. we have what we concluded, even though the range changed just a bit on the north end of the valley, we kept the same range in our final conclusions, where you have the two separate boxes, right? We have the loss of property rights at about an 8 to 10% diminution. And then on top of that, you add the increased flood risk of another 7 to 25% approximately. And those factors change based off of the information we'll get for phase 2, the depth and the duration of the flooding on each individual property. But if you have any more questions, you can let me know another time. But the executive summary in here, it pretty well captures what we wanted to say on the project. So I think that's all we have for time. But thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Good, and Tim as well. Thanks. Good discussion. As you can tell, we've hired some real experts here. They've done a real thorough job and documenting their evidence, which I think will bode well for us as we get going to acquire those flowage easements.